The high pass was a graveyard of ambition. The air, thin at 11,000 feet, carried the sharp report of splintering oak, a sound that cut through the incessant wind. It was late August 1878, and the Thornbell wagon train was stalled, perhaps permanently, on the western slope of the divide. Below, Elias Thorne, the train's captain and a man built like the heavy wagons he championed, stared in fury at the wreckage of his lead rig. The King Wagon, a custom-built freighter weighing nearly 3,000 pounds empty, had snapped its 4-inch thick hickory front axle like a twig. It was lodged between two granite rockers, its 5,000-pound load of flour, tools, and mining equipment threatening to pitch down the 14% grade. His other wagons, massive prairie schooners designed for the flatlands, were strung out down the trail, their 8-oxen teams heaving, unable to move on the treacherous narrow track. They had spent $200 per wagon in Missouri, equipping them with extra iron, wide tires, and heavy-duty brakes. Now that investment was just 60 tons of dead weight, a monument to conventional wisdom. And then a sound. Not the groan of heavy wood or the crack of a whip. It was a light, rhythmic creaking. Arthur Shaw and his toy wagon appeared from the switchback below. The settlers had mocked this thing for 1,000 miles. It was impossibly slender. Its wheels were tall but thin, like a spider's legs. Its cargo box seemed to float on a skeletal frame, pulled not by 10 oxen, but by 2 bored-looking mules. While Thorne's convoy struggled to make 3 miles a day, Shaw's contraption was averaging 12, even in the foothills. Now, as the desperate settlers watched, Shaw guided his mules off the established track onto the rocky scree field. The wagon didn't lurch, it flowed. The left wheel climbed a 2-foot boulder, the frame twisted, and the cargo box stayed almost level. He passed the entire stalled, shattered convoy without stopping, his family sitting calmly in the wagon bed. What did this quiet, unassuming man understand about the physics of force, materials, and the brutal geometry of the Rocky Mountains that an entire generation of seasoned freighters had completely missed? The year was 1878. The great overland migrations had been happening for decades, but the guidebooks and manuals were still written by men who had mastered the first half of the journey, the Great Plains. The Bible for any emigrant was the prairie schooner, the lighter, nimbler descendant of the colossal Conestoga wagon. The wisdom was absolute and unchallenged. Taught in the outfitting yards of Independence and St. Joseph, a wagon, the experts decreed, must be a fortress. It must be built of the heaviest, densest hardwoods available. White oak for the frame and spokes, hickory for the axles, Osage orange if it could be had. Its tires were bands of iron, often 4 inches wide and a ½ inch thick, weighing hundreds of pounds alone. The wagon box, 10 to 12 feet long, was built like a boat, with a sway-backed curve to keep cargo from shifting. Empty, a light schooner weighed 500 pounds. Loaded, it was expected to carry 4 zolzalas to 6 zolzalas pounds of freight. This was the right way. This was the $150–200 vehicle, plus $400 for a 10-oxen team. That was the price of admission to the West. The philosophy was simple: brute force. The West was a savage, powerful land, and it could only be met with overwhelming mass and rigidity. The manuals specified axle grease recipes, pine tar and tallow, load lashing techniques, and veterinary care for oxen. They did not, however, offer a solution for what happened when a 7,000-pound rigid box met an 18% grade and a field of solid granite. The book was written for a sea of grass, and these settlers were sailing into a hurricane of rock. Elias Thorne was a product of this system. He had run freight on the Santa Fe Trail, and he believed in mass. To prepare for the Rockies, his mountain modifications had consisted of adding more iron. He bolted steel plates to the wagon tongues. He insisted on oversized 3-inch axles. He added a second heavy-duty brake system. His personal wagon weighed 3,000 pounds empty. On the trail, it became a monster that consumed its own power. The problem began in the foothills, long before the high pass. The traditional 4-inch wide wheels, designed to float on the soft prairie sod, were a disaster on the rocky trail. They had too much surface area, constantly catching the edges of rocks, wrenching the wheels and frame with every yard. The sheer dead weight of the wagon was a constant enemy. On a simple 6% grade, Thorne's 10-oxen team was fighting to move over 1,000 pounds of wagon before they even began to move the 500 pounds of cargo. The physics of rigidity was their undoing. When a rigid wheel on a rigid axle, bolted to a rigid frame, hits an immovable rock, the force has nowhere to go. It finds the weakest point. For Thorne's convoy, this meant a constant hail of minor disasters that culminated in the pass. They had averaged 3 to 4 wheel replacements per wagon since leaving the plains, at a cost of $25 per wheel. They lost 18 oxen to exhaustion and broken legs before the final ascent. The colossal iron-bound wagons weren't vehicles, they were anchors. The settlers, having followed the book to the letter, were now trapped by the very thing they believed would save them. Their fortresses had become their prisons. Briggs Arthur Shaw had never freighted on the Santa Fe Trail. He was the son of a cabinet maker from Vermont, and his own apprenticeship had been in a high-end carriage manufactory in New Haven, Connecticut. He had not built freight wagons. He had built lightweight, responsive broughams and rockaways for wealthy doctors and bankers. His mentor was a reclusive, elderly Frenchman who had studied the principles of Napoleonic-era field artillery, cannons designed to be moved fast over broken terrain. This mentor had beaten a single lesson into him. Weight is the enemy. Rigidity is failure. A structure must yield to the road, not fight it. Shaw learned that strength did not come from mass, but from design. He learned how to use wood's natural properties, the spring of hickory, the tensile strength of ash, to absorb and dissipate shock. After moving west to Illinois, he had spent a winter observing the local Potawatomi. He was fascinated by the travois, 2 simple long poles, dragged by a horse, that could carry a significant load over the roughest ground. The design was 100% flexible. There were no rigid joints to break. Later, working with loggers in Wisconsin, he saw how their light, flexible dray sleds could haul massive logs over frozen, uneven ground. He began to sketch. His idea was a hybrid, a vehicle with the light-touch principles of a city carriage, the flexible geometry of a travois, and the strength-through-flexibility of a logging sled. When he built his wagon in his backyard, the neighbors laughed. When he arrived at the assembly point in Missouri, the other settlers, led by Elias Thorne, openly mocked it. "That's a gentleman's buggy, Shaw," Thorne had said, spitting tobacco. "It'll snap in half at the first river crossing. It's a toy." Arthur Shaw's toy was built on a foundation of completely different principles. He built it himself over 3 months at a cost of only $70. He couldn't afford and didn't want the heavy white oak. His materials were ash and hickory, selected for their flex-to-weight ratio. The entire wagon, empty, weighed 950 pounds. This alone meant that his 2-mule team, costing $120, could move it more efficiently than Thorne's 10-oxen team, which had cost $400. But the real genius was in the frame. It wasn't one frame, it was 2. Shaw had built a running gear subframe for the wheels and axles, and a separate lightweight cargo box frame. These 2 frames were not bolted together. They were connected by 5 hickory cross members that floated in their mortises, padded with thick rawhide. This was the impossible trick, articulation. When the left front wheel climbed a rock, only that corner of the running gear lifted. The floating cross members absorbed the twist, and the cargo box, with his family and 200 pounds of supplies, stayed relatively level. The shock was dampened and dissipated, not transmitted. His wheels were another point of ridicule. They were tall, 5 feet in the rear, but the rims were only 5 inches wide. "They'll sink in the mud," Thorne had bellowed. Shaw knew better. The narrow rims cut through mud and loose scree to find the hardpan below, offering less rolling resistance, not more. The tall diameter gave them a massive mechanical advantage, turning 1-foot-high obstacles into minor bumps. Where Thorne used iron, Shaw used laminated wood and rawhide bindings, which absorbed vibrations that would have sheared iron bolts. To the settlers, it looked fragile, skeletal, and incomplete. To a mountain, it was the first vehicle that spoke its language. The conflict that played out on the high pass was not just between two men. It was a battle of engineering philosophies. Thorne's philosophy was that of the 19th century industrial revolution. The West was an adversary. A mountain was a wall. The only way through was to apply more power, more mass, and more brute force. His wagon was a hammer, designed to smash its way through. But the mountain, he learned, did not smash. It simply held its ground, and the hammer shattered. This was the school of rigidity. It prized mass above all, believing that sturdy and heavy were the same thing. It translated all force directly, and so, when a 700-pound wagon moving at 1 mile per hour hit a granite boulder, the resulting impact force, concentrated on a single spoke or axle box, was catastrophic. Arthur Shaw's philosophy was organic. The West was not an adversary. It was a complex system to be negotiated. A mountain was not a wall. It was a series of problems. His wagon was a key, designed to fit the lock. This was the school of flexibility. Shaw understood that true strength came from the ability to yield and recover. He had traded dead weight for intelligent design. His wagon didn't fight the terrain, it conformed to it. Every time a hickory spoke flexed, every time a rawhide binding stretched, every time the articulated frame twisted, the wagon was dissipating energy. Where Thorne's wagon concentrated stress until a point of failure, Shaw's wagon distributed stress across its entire skeletal system. It was the difference between a dead oak log and a living willow branch. One snaps, the other bends. The first to notice the difference, really notice it, was Captain Marcus Daly. He was a surveyor with the U.S. Army Corps of Topographical Engineers, attached to the train to map the pass for a potential railroad. Daly was a man of instruments and logbooks, not frontier bravado. He carried a clinometer for measuring grades, a pocket watch and a notebook, which he filled with precise, dispassionate observations. His first note on shore came at the Platte River crossing, a half-mile of mud and shallow water. Thorne's convoy, with its 4-inch wide wheels, became hopelessly mired. The wide wheels packed the mud into a sticky, impassable cylinder. It took 12 hours, 110 oxen, and 30 men to move 12 wagons across. Daly noted, Thorne convoy, 004 mph AVG, 3 oxen lost. Later, in the same log, he wrote, Shaw rig, arrived 4 p.m. 2 mules, narrow wheels cut through mud to gravel bed, crossed in 18 minutes. 6 mph AVG, no difficulty. This pattern repeated. In the foothills, on a long 6% grade, Daly walked alongside both. He timed Thorne's lead wagon. 9 mph, requires 30-minute rest per hour, animal distress evident. He then walked with Shaw. 2 mph, mules walking steady, no rest stops required. The wagon, it makes no sound, only the creak of the leather. Daly, a man of numbers, began to see the toy not as a folly but as a theorem. He calculated that Shaw was using 80% less animal power to move his cargo at twice the speed. The asceticism in the camp was beginning to waver, replaced by a quiet, baffled curiosity. To understand Shaw's wagon, one had to see it as a system, a series of layers of defense against the catastrophic failure that plagued the traditional wagons. The first layer was the point of contact, the wheel. The tall 5-foot diameter was a simple lever. It gave the wheel immense mechanical advantage, allowing it to roll over an obstacle that a smaller wheel would be stopped by. The narrow 1/5-inch iron rim was counterintuitive, but it was key. On rock, it presented a smaller target, less likely to be pinched or chipped. On loose scree, it sank to find purchase. The second layer was the material choice. The slender spokes were not oak, but second-growth hickory, a wood prized for its ability to bend and return to shape. They were designed to flex, absorbing the initial sharp shock from the rim. The axles, too, were hickory, not 3-inch thick oak blocks, but 2-inch thick laminated and shaped beams, engineered to twist slightly under torsional load. The third and most brilliant layer was the articulated frame. This was Shaw's secret. The running gear, wheels and axles formed one chassis. The cargo box was its own, separate chassis. The 5 hickory crossmembers that connected them sat in unbolted mortises, padded with thick, greased rawhide. This floating connection allowed the running gear to twist up to 15 degrees in either direction without transferring that stress to the cargo box. This single innovation meant that all 4 wheels could always remain in contact with the ground on uneven terrain, providing maximum traction and stability, while the rigid schooners would often have one wheel hanging uselessly in the air. The final layer was the braking system. Thorne's wagons used a massive lever that shoved a wood block against the iron rim, a system prone to locking up, skidding, and overheating. Shaw used a screw mechanism brake that allowed for graduated pressure from the driver's seat, applying force smoothly. But his best brake was his wagon's 950-pound weight. It simply didn't have the mass to create a runaway. It was, from the ground up, a machine designed for mountains. The climax came on that 3-mile, 1,800-foot switchback. The early snow had melted and refrozen overnight, coating the granite rocks in a thin, treacherous layer of black ice. Elias Thorne, desperate, ordered his teams to double up. They chained 20 oxen to the lead wagon. The sound was a nightmare, the air filled with the roar of men, the crack of whips, and the agonizing bellows of the animals. 500 yards up the 14% grade, a lead ox slipped. The chain jerked, the wagon slid laterally, and the left front wheel, which had been pressing against a rock, took the entire 500-pound lateral load. The sound of the axles snapping was like a cannon shot. The wagon collapsed, spilling 4,000 pounds of flour. It was a total, unrecoverable loss. Further up, Thorne's second wagon, the one captained by his brother, hit a rocker on the 18% apex. The wagon, too rigid to flex, twisted. The 2-inch thick iron kingpin connecting the front axle to the frame sheared in half. The wagon was now immobile, its front axle detached, blocking the only path. The train was done. The settlers looked at the sky, at the broken wagons, and at Thorne, who sat on a rock, his head in his hands. Then came Shaw. The trail was blocked. Thorne's brother yelled, "It's over, Shaw! We're trapped!" Arthur Shaw looked at the blockage. He looked at the steep scree field to the right, a 40-degree slope of loose, sharp rocks that no one would ever call a trail. He said nothing. He just clicked his tongue. The 2 mules, sensing his confidence, leaned into their harnesses. Captain Daly, notebook in hand, watched in disbelief. "My God," he whispered. The toy wagon left the trail. It climbed the scree. The left wheel, 5 feet high, found purchase and pulled the wagon up onto a 2-foot-high boulder. The frame twisted. Daly estimated 20 degrees, but the cargo box with Shaw's wife and child remained almost level. The right wheel dropped into a rut, the hickory axle bent, and the wagon walked. It crawled over the scree, a skeletal, spider-like thing, conforming to the terrain. It rejoined the trail 50 yards past the wreckage. It never stopped. It passed the stranded settlers, a silent, flexible ghost. 3 hours later, Arthur Shaw and his family were at the summit making camp. The summit, Shaw didn't just celebrate. He and his wife, Sarah, looked back down at the freezing, desperate people. The snow was beginning to fall in earnest. They unhitched their mules, cached 600 pounds of their own supplies under a tarp, and turned the wagon around. They drove the 950-pound toy back down the 18% grade. They arrived at the Miller family's wagon. Their oxen were spent, and their youngest child was feverish, the high-altitude air aggravating her lungs. "We can't take your wagon," Sarah Shaw said, her voice firm. She was as much an engineer as her husband. "We take essentials, bedding that child, and 100 pounds of food. No more." She was managing the system, understanding its load-to-weight limits. They loaded the sick child and the Miller family's hopes into the wagon. Shaw and his mules made the ascent again, the toy now loaded with 200 pounds over its design limit, on an 18% grade, on ice. It performed flawlessly. Shaw's wagon, in the next 24 hours, made 3 more trips. It ferried the women, the children, the sick, and the most critical supplies, medicine, seed, bedding, from 3 other families to the summit. The wagon, designed for 1 family, the toy that shouldn't have made it past the river, became the lifeline for 16 people. The men, including a humbled Elias Thorne, were left below to salvage what they could and walk. Weeks soon they wintered in the valley past the pass. Captain Daly's report, filed the following spring with the Department of the Interior, became an internal legend. He wrote, "The standard prairie schooner, weighing 500 to 3 lbs, is not merely inefficient, it is a liability." Of the 12 wagons in the Thorne party, 4 were total losses, and 5 required extensive and costly repairs. The single Shaw model wagon, weighing 950 lbs, performed flawlessly. It demonstrated a load-to-weight ratio of 1:1 payload to wagon versus the Thorne wagon's 1:5 but achieved 5 times the route efficiency with 80% less animal power. The numbers were damning. Thorne convoy, 110 oxen, 12 wagons. 44 days to cross the 100-mile mountain range. Lost 4 wagons, 18 oxen. Shaw wagon, 2 mules, 1 wagon. 19 days to cross the same range, most of that waiting for the others. Lost 0. That winter, Elias Thorne, a man whose pride was as massive as his old wagons, approached Arthur Shaw's cabin. He didn't apologize. He held out a piece of hickory. "The floating cross member," Thorne said, his voice low. "The rawhide padding. Show me how you shape the mortise." By the spring of 1879, the Thorne-Shaw Mountain Wagon Company was in business, disassembling the shattered schooners and building 3 new articulated wagons from the salvaged parts. 5 years later, the town of Summit Valley, Colorado, was a small but thriving hub. The wagons moving down its main street were not the low, heavy, boat-like schooners of the plains. They were taller, lighter, more skeletal. You could see the Shaw DNA in all of them. The local blacksmith and wheelwright shop, run by Elias Thorne, had a large sign hanging over its door. "Thorne-Shaw Mountain Wagons, guaranteed to flex. We build for the pass, not the prairie." Arthur Shaw never became a railroad baron or a wealthy man. He was a craftsman. But his design, his toy, became the unheralded standard for high-altitude freighting and farming, the true vehicle that settled the inter-mountain West. The great, iron-bound wagons were monuments to hubris, and the Rockies had shattered them. The mountains were not conquered by brute force. They were negotiated by intelligence. Arthur Shaw had proved what the master wheelwrights had forgotten, and what the mountains had always known. True strength is not found in rigidity and mass, but in the calculated, humble, and intelligent act of flexibility.